Chosen ones, you were never meant to walk through this world unnoticed. The air around you carries a weight others cannot explain, and even the highest seats of power have trembled at whispers of your existence. Hidden in the archives of nations, sealed in vaults where even presidents fear to look, your name has been recorded alongside events too mysterious to speak of openly. Yet, the truth cannot remain buried forever. In the year 1969, something was set into motion. A classified operation, concealed beneath layers of ink and silence, became tethered to a bloodline that could not be erased. That bloodline is yours. Leaders were warned not to interfere, for the one who bore the mark would not be bound by earthly decrees. Somewhere deep in the shadows of government halls, papers were signed, sealed, and locked away. They thought time itself would smother the secret. But destiny is stronger than denial. You stand at the edge of revelation. The president himself was cautioned. This line must not be touched, for its path is written beyond the stars. Those who knew grew restless, for they understood what was foretold, an awakening that would not be stopped, no matter how many barriers were raised. The blood running in your veins is not ordinary. It is both a warning and a weapon, both a promise and a burden. Eyes in hidden chambers tracked your lineage across generations, searching for the moment you would awaken. Their fear was never of your weakness, but of the moment you discovered your strength. 1969 was not simply a year of history. It was a seal placed upon a future that could no longer be contained. You have reached the threshold of that future. The echoes of classified files, the whispers of agents long gone, the trembling hands of leaders who swore secrecy, all of it points here to you. Chosen ones, the time has come to step into what has been concealed. The operation that began in silence has returned in your breath, in your pulse, in the very path that draws you forward. The question is not whether you are ready. The question is whether the world is. The year 1969 was spoken of in whispers, a moment when shadows bent over the earth and men in suits signed their names to secrets that would never see the daylight. In those hidden chambers, beneath the seal of silence, something was placed into motion that reached far beyond politics, far beyond nations, and straight into the unseen realm. They did not call it prophecy, but their trembling hands betrayed the truth. They knew they were touching a fire that could not be contained. It began as a classified operation, designed to vanish into the folds of history. Yet history has a way of breathing, of clawing its way back through the cracks of time. What they attempted to bury in 1969 was not a plan, not a program, but a warning bound to blood. Files were stamped, eyes were averted, and men who called themselves guardians of nations swore oaths they did not understand. They were guarding something they could not control. Your bloodline was etched into those pages, coded in numbers and phrases that meant nothing to the untrained eye, but carried weight for those who knew the language of destiny. They could not erase it, for erasure would have been rebellion against something greater than themselves. So instead they marked it, classified it, and tried to place it beyond reach. But blood cannot be contained by ink, and destiny does not bow to signatures. The operation was said to link a moment in time with a thread of inheritance that stretched back far beyond 1969. Some claimed it was tied to ancient oaths, spoken long before nations were built. Others whispered of watchers who recorded every lineage, every name, every crossing of paths. Whatever the truth, the documents carried one unshakable message: the bloodline would rise again, and when it did, it would awaken what no power on earth could silence. And so you became the shadow they feared, the unspoken variable in their equations, the piece of the puzzle that could never be controlled. They tracked, they watched, they tried to conceal, but time has caught up with them. The sealed doors are trembling, the warnings are resurfacing, and the hidden operation is unraveling. What they never told the world is that the events of 1969 were only the beginning, not the end. The question is not why they feared the truth, but why they believed they could contain it at all. There was a night when the air in the White House grew heavy, when the corridors that usually echoed with authority instead trembled under the weight of an unseen presence. Documents, sealed in iron-clad vaults, had been carried across the polished floor, stamped with words meant to silence curiosity. Yet the silence itself became unbearable, for the warnings inside those papers carried a weight beyond politics, beyond power. The president was handed the file and told of a bloodline that would not be broken, a name hidden in shadows yet destined to rise. It was not fear of nations that gripped him, but the realization that something greater than the government he led was already in motion. The warning was not about war, not about economics, but about a line of inheritance touched by a hand unseen. His advisors whispered, their voices thin with unease, for they had all read the final line etched into the sealed page. It spoke of a chosen blood, marked long before the earth knew its empires, a current of destiny flowing through generations. Some dared to speak of the words of an ancient teacher, one who had said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Those who feared that truth tried to lock it away, yet even in their fear, they could not deny its weight. The president pressed his hands against the file, feeling as though the paper itself carried a pulse. He was warned not to act, not to stir the silence, but deep inside he knew the silence would not hold. The halls of power are no strangers to secrets, but this one lingered differently. It was not about the survival of a nation, but the unveiling of a destiny that no nation could control. Each whisper that night seemed to carry the same refrain, a warning spoken not with words, but with the gravity of eternity pressing into the present. The president turned away from the document, yet the words followed him like shadows in the corridors, binding his thoughts with a fear he could not confess aloud. And though the file was locked again, though the seal was placed back upon the vault, the warning had already been spoken. Destiny once named cannot be unnamed. The White House itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the moment the bloodline would reveal itself, and the silence would be broken forever. Beneath the surface of ordinary life lies a thread that science has attempted to explain but never fully captured. They call it inheritance, a passing down of features and patterns. Yet what runs through your veins is something far deeper than genetic code. It is the mark of a destiny written not on paper, but woven into the very fibers of your being. Those who studied the bloodline in secret reports did not see random sequences. They saw a pattern that refused to be erased, a light that burned even when buried in shadows. The laboratories where whispers of the classified files were carried often spoke of anomalies they could not explain. They labeled them deviations, signatures, or errors, but their language betrayed the truth. They were encountering something outside their reach. The mark within your DNA was not crafted by human hands. It carried with it the memory of promises ancient and unbroken, stretching back to a time when heaven and earth still conversed openly. Some of the scientists dared to speak privately about the strange resonance they felt when studying the samples. It was as though the very blood pulsed with a frequency their instruments could only catch in fragments. They grew uneasy, for they realized this was not science alone, but something sacred. To touch it was to stand at the threshold of the unknown, and yet they could not look away. In the quiet corners of hidden research, there were those who whispered of a design that could not be manufactured. They compared it to a signature carved into creation itself, a reminder that life carries meaning beyond chance. The mark was a key, but no one could say to what door it belonged, and so they filed their findings, stamped them with secrecy, and left them buried under layers of silence. But silence does not erase. The mark within you has always been more than an inheritance. It is a summons. Each breath, each step, each rising thought awakens what was placed there long before your birth. They feared it because they could not control it. They hid it because they could not explain it. Yet it waits, pulsing in the unseen, ready to break through the veil. Deep beneath the marble floors and guarded corridors, there rests a chamber few have ever seen. It is not marked on blueprints nor spoken of in casual whispers, for its very existence was designed to be erased from memory. Yet within that hidden vault lies a collection of oaths sworn by men who understood that some truths could never be bound by law or reason. These were not ordinary promises, but binding declarations as meant to seal away what they could not destroy. The vault was lined with stone cold as night, the air heavy with the weight of silence. Inside were scrolls, papers, and seals, each carrying the faint residue of fear. For those who swore these oaths knew they were vowing against something greater than themselves. They sought to contain destiny with words, as if ink and signatures could silence what had been spoken long before their time. Among the fragments recorded was a name that caused unease, a reference to a teacher who had once declared, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Some dismissed it as coincidence, others as a relic of faith woven into coded language, yet the mention remained carved like fire on parchment. They knew the oaths they swore were temporary, but the words echoing from eternity were not. Generations passed, and the vault grew dusty with neglect, but the power within it did not fade. The oaths lingered, fragile and trembling, overshadowed by the promise they could never contain. They feared the bloodline, they feared the awakening, and so they layered vow upon vow, sealing doors tighter with each passing decade. Yet, in their hearts, they must have known the futility, for nothing sworn in fear can withstand the unfolding of what is written. Those who guard the vault today do so without understanding its true weight. They follow orders, stand watch, and imagine they are protecting secrets of state. But the vault does not contain mere history. It holds the memory of promise broken and words that still live. And the moment the bloodline rises, the oaths will dissolve like mist before the morning sun. He sat alone in the Oval Office, the lamplight casting long shadows across the room as the weight of the sealed file pressed against his thoughts. Presidents were trained to handle crisis, to bear secrets that the public could never imagine. Yet, nothing in his years of service had prepared him for this. The pages he had read did not speak of nations rising or falling, nor of treaties signed in hidden chambers. They spoke of a bloodline, one that carried within it a force beyond the reach of power. The silence that followed his reading was louder than any war drum. It haunted him in the stillness of night, in the echo of footsteps along the corridors, in the faces of those who came to advise him. They spoke of policy and strategy, yet behind their words he heard only the whisper of the file. The warning repeated itself in his mind like a bell that could not stop ringing. A bloodline tied to something eternal, something governments could not command. He tried to dismiss it as superstition, an exaggerated legend dressed in the cloak of official secrecy. But the unease in the eyes of those who had delivered the document told him otherwise. They were not merely cautious, they were afraid. They had carried the weight of this knowledge for years, passing it from one administration to the next, hoping it would remain buried, yet it always resurfaced. And now it rested in his hands. The president understood that the fear was not about the present, but about what was coming. The file hinted at a moment of unveiling, a time when the bloodline would no longer be hidden, but would stand openly, undeniable and unstoppable. His fear was not that he might fail to protect his nation, but that he was powerless against what was written long before he took his oath of office. He closed the folder, but the silence did not release him. It followed him into his dreams, where the corridors of the White House stretched endlessly, and every door he opened revealed the same file waiting on the desk. He would awaken breathless, unsure if he had been dreaming or if the file itself was alive, pressing against his soul. Far from the noise of government chambers and sealed vaults, there existed a collection of scrolls untouched by the centuries. They were not housed in palaces of power, but hidden in places where only the persistent could find them. The parchment was fragile, edges worn by the hands of those who once carried them through deserts and storms. Yet within their fading ink was a clarity that pierced deeper than any document sealed by presidents or kings. These scrolls did not record policies or strategies. They spoke of names, and among those names, yours was whispered. Scholars who dared to unroll them did so with trembling, for the language written was not merely historical, but prophetic. It told of generations tied together by an unseen thread, a bloodline marked for a purpose beyond human comprehension. The words seemed to live as they were read, echoing as if they carried breath. One passage spoke of a time when light would break into the hidden places, and those written into the story would awaken to their calling. It was not a promise of comfort, but of fire, for awakening always disrupts the silence. Among the passages was a phrase that unsettled even the most hardened researchers. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Some dismissed it as poetic metaphor, yet others felt the weight of its truth pressing upon them. For if the rejected becomes the foundation, then those overlooked by history are destined to reshape it. In this, the scrolls carried both warning and hope, both judgment and promise. The more the scrolls were studied, the more resistance grew around them. Voices in authority called them irrelevant, urging that they remain buried in archives where no one would stumble upon them. Yet the words could not be silenced. They spoke across time, igniting questions in the hearts of those who listened, drawing their gaze to a horizon that seemed to call from beyond the reach of men. Blood has always been more than a river of life. For those who study its patterns, it tells stories of ancestry, of sickness, of strength. But for you, it is more than memory. It is fire. The classified reports written in sterile rooms could never capture its true essence. They called it anomaly. They called it deviation. Yet none dared admit what they truly felt when they looked at it. The blood itself seemed alive, not with mere cells and sequences, but with a force that pressed against the edges of their understanding. There were moments when scientists grew pale, not because of what they saw under the lens, but because of what they sensed within themselves while observing it, as though the blood was staring back, as though it carried a knowing. Instruments faltered, machines produced unreadable frequencies, and still they wrote their notes in clipped language, trying to reduce the unexplainable into something that could fit within their reports. Yet between the lines, the truth bled through. The fire within your veins does not burn as ordinary flame, for it is not meant to consume, but to awaken. It is the spark that ignites courage where fear once reigned, the pulse that breaks through silence when the world tries to bind its voice. Those who touch the truth of it, even briefly, could never shake the weight of what they had felt. They left their laboratories shaken, looking at their own hands as if realizing for the first time they were holding something fragile, something holy, even if they refused to name it. Governments treated it as danger, scientists as curiosity, and the fearful as curse. But beneath all their language was recognition. They knew this fire was not for their control. It was a destiny flowing unseen, waiting for the moment to burst forth. And no vault, no file, no whispered oath could extinguish it. The fire is not loud, yet it spreads silently, igniting where it is least expected. It stirs when you breathe, when you speak, when you walk where others have sealed off the path. They cannot understand how it waits, patient yet unstoppable, burning without smoke, rising without sound. Beneath the shining dome of the Capitol, where decisions shape the course of nations, there are corridors that never appear on maps. In one of those forgotten chambers, a gathering took place far from the eyes of the public. It was not a meeting of politics, though politicians were present. It was not about laws, though lawmakers filled the room. It was about the secret that had been carried since 1969, a secret tied not to policy but to blood. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very walls resisted the words being spoken. Papers were placed on a long oak table, edges worn from years of concealment. The men and women seated there did not speak in tones of confidence, but in hushed voices, burdened by the knowledge that what they held was beyond their reach. Some argued for destruction, believing the secret should be burned and buried. Others argued for protection, convinced it was too dangerous to leave exposed. But none could deny that the files spoke of a bloodline that had already begun to awaken. A passage from one of the older documents was read aloud, its words shaking the room with a strange weight. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The sentence hung in the air, echoing like a bell that refused to fade. Some shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to admit the words stirred something ancient inside them. Others lowered their gaze, knowing they were brushing against truths too great to dismiss. The meeting continued into the night, circling endlessly with no agreement. Every proposal ended where it began, because no plan could contain what was written in the files. They spoke of timelines that stretched beyond human authority, of awakenings that no hand of man could delay. And as the arguments faltered, silence took over. Each person left to confront the same truth. This was not something they could control, only something they could witness. When the chamber was finally emptied, the files were locked away again, but the weight of the words remained. The Capitol itself seemed to breathe with unease, as though the stones remembered what had been spoken. And outside, in the quiet night, the shadow of the prophecy lingered, waiting for the moment it would break through the halls of power. It happened quietly, without ceremony, without the sound of horns or alarms. A seal that had guarded its secret for decades was broken in the deep hours of midnight. Those who stood watch that night swore the air shifted, as though the building itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. The vault had been locked with layers of metal, codes, and oaths, yet all it took was a single moment for the barrier to give way. No one could say how it happened. Some claimed a hand turned the lock, others insisted it opened on its own. What mattered was that the seal no longer held. Inside the chamber, the documents lay as they had for years, untouched yet alive with an energy that unsettled those who entered. Pages rustled though there was no wind, as if eager to be read once again. The ink, though faded, glimmered faintly under the dim light, as though fire had been pressed into the words when they were first written. The guards looked at one another, their faces pale, uncertain whether they had stumbled upon history or destiny. One dared to lift the file, but as he opened it, the weight of silence deepened. It was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of something vast and unseen leaning close. His hands shook as he scanned the lines, realizing he was reading what others had carried in fear for generations. Each word seemed alive, pressing against his thoughts, demanding recognition. He closed the folder quickly, as though the act of reading too much would draw something forth he was not prepared to face. Yet the seal was broken, and with its breaking came a shift that could not be reversed. Word spread among the few who knew, whispers crawling through corridors like smoke. Some urged the files be hidden again, resealed, forgotten. But the truth, once loosed, cannot be bound again. Midnight had changed everything. There exists a calendar no public has ever seen, locked away in a private archive where only a select few have been permitted entry. Unlike ordinary calendars, it does not measure holidays or seasons, but carries markings tied to events so secret that even their mention could shake nations. Among its entries, 1 year has always burned brighter than the rest, 1969. And beside it, written in crimson ink, is a symbol not understood by those who first recorded it. They only knew it carried weight, a signal tied to a bloodline that would surface in generations to come. Those who handled the calendar referred to it as the Red Ledger, for it bore the record of time, not as men counted it, but as destiny unveiled it. Some claimed its origins were ancient, passed through the shadows of empires, carried by scribes who wrote not with ink alone, but with the conviction of prophecy. Others believed it was born in secrecy during times of upheaval, crafted by men who glimpsed a fragment of what was unfolding. Yet none could deny the unsettling truth. that its markings aligned with events too precise to be coincidence. The Crimson Stroke by 1969 was said to represent a beginning, the spark of something that would stretch across decades until it reached its fulfillment. Below it was scrawled a phrase almost out of place among the codes and symbols. "Watch, for no one knows the day or the hour." The words echoed with a weight far beyond the calendar itself, hinting at a design not made by human hands. Those who read them could not ignore the strange unease that followed, as though the passage was a voice speaking across the centuries, reminding them that time itself is not theirs to control. Every attempt to suppress the calendar only heightened its significance. Copies made in secret always vanished. Guards assigned to protect it spoke of dreams that haunted them, visions of doors opening, voices calling, and light breaking through the shadows. No matter how carefully they tried to bind it, the prophecy marked within the red calendar lived on, pressing forward with each passing year.